Felix only meant to smile for a second, but the moment Hyunjin saw it, slow, amused, almost cruel in the blue wash of backstage light, something in his gaze darkened enough to ruin them both. The hallway behind the stage smelled like hairspray, sweat, and overheated wires. Staff rushed past with headsets pressed to their ears, shoes clicking against black tile, voices clipped and urgent under the distant thunder of fans screaming from beyond the curtain. The music from the main stage bled through the walls in deep, vibrating pulses, bass curling beneath Felix's ribs like a second heartbeat. It should have felt familiar. Safe. Another show, another performance, another night spent pretending that the tension between them was only chemistry sharpened for cameras. Instead, it felt like standing too close to lightning. Felix leaned against the wall beside a stack of equipment cases, one hand curled around a half-empty bottle of water, the other still warm from where a makeup artist had dusted powder over his skin. He was smiling at something too small to matter. One of the dancers had whispered a joke in his ear, something ridiculous and harmless, and Felix had laughed, head tipping back, sunlight bright and careless. That was when Hyunjin walked in. He stopped 3 steps into the corridor. His expression did not change at first. It was worse that way. Hyunjin's face remained almost elegant in its stillness, eyes lined in stage makeup, blonde hair falling in soft strands over his forehead, his mouth neither tense nor relaxed. But Felix knew him too well. He knew the silence that meant irritation, the stillness that meant restraint, the almost invisible shift in Hyunjin's jaw that meant he was angry enough to make himself quiet. And Hyunjin was looking at Felix as though he had just witnessed something unforgivable. The dancer excused himself with a laugh he probably regretted the second he noticed the air turn sharp. Felix watched him disappear around the corner, leaving behind only the smell of cologne and the echo of a joke that had stopped being funny the moment Hyunjin arrived. Felix should have looked away. He should have straightened up, said something easy, something harmless, something that would smooth the sudden tension stretching between them like wire. Instead, he smiled, not kindly, not innocently. It was a small smile, tilted and dangerous, sharpened by instinct Felix didn't fully understand until it was already there. A challenge disguised as amusement. A silent question. Are you jealous? Hyunjin's eyes flickered. That was all. A single crack in his composure, so slight no one else would have noticed. But Felix saw it. Saw the flash of something hot and ugly beneath the calm. Possessiveness, offense, want. And God, it was a terrible thing to notice. It was worse that Felix liked it. Hyunjin moved toward him slowly, each step deliberate, until he was standing close enough for Felix to smell his perfume beneath the sweat and stage smoke, something expensive and dark, soft as velvet and twice as dangerous. You seem entertained, Hyunjin said. His voice was quiet, almost casual. It was the quiet that made Felix's pulse jump. Felix lifted one shoulder. Should I not be? Hyunjin's gaze dropped briefly to Felix's mouth, then returned to his eyes with enough force to feel like impact. Not by him. It was small, sharp, unmistakable. Felix should have let it go. He knew that. Knew this was the exact point where better choices existed, where softer people stepped back, laughed it off, changed the subject, saved themselves the trouble of wanting too much. But Felix had always had a weakness for beautiful mistakes, so he tilted his head, let his smile deepen, and said, "You sound jealous." Silence that followed was so immediate it felt physical. Somewhere beyond the corridor, the crowd roared. A stage cue sounded. Staff ran past the entrance without glancing in, too busy to notice the dangerous stillness pressed into the narrow strip of shadow where Felix and Hyunjin stood. Hyunjin stared at him. Then he laughed once, low and humorless, and stepped even closer. Felix's breath caught up close. Hyunjin was devastating. Not because he was beautiful, though he was painfully so, but because he was always too controlled until suddenly he was. Because every emotion in him lived like a blade under silk, hidden until the exact moment it cut. "Do you want me to be jealous?" Hyunjin asked softly. Felix forgot briefly how to answer. He could hear the blood in his ears. Could feel the cool metal edge of the equipment case against his spine. Hyunjin's voice slid over his skin like a hand and made something reckless uncurl in his chest. This was the problem. Hyunjin had always been too good at sounding calm while making everything feel dangerous. Felix swallowed. "Depends. On what? On whether you'd do anything about it. Hyunjin went still in a way that made Felix instantly aware he had crossed into something irreversible. There were 1,000 ways this could go wrong. Too many eyes. Too much risk. Too many things between them left unsaid for too long, old resentment, sharper affection, the private gravity of years spent orbiting each other so closely they had forgotten where one ended and the other began. Hyunjin had always hidden himself inside elegance, inside control, inside irony and practiced indifference. Felix had always hidden himself inside laughter. Neither of them had ever been as careless as this. Hyunjin's hand came up slowly, fingers brushing the edge of Felix's jaw as though asking permission and denying it in the same breath. The touch was light, barely there. It still sent heat skidding down Felix's spine. "You like dangerous things too much," Hyunjin murmured. Felix's heart hit once, hard enough to hurt. "And you like pretending you're not one of them." Changed in Hyunjin's face then, something subtle and fatal, a crack in the restraint. A brief, raw honesty that made him look younger and far more dangerous all at once. The truth arrived in pieces. Felix could suddenly read too clearly. Hyunjin hated jealousy because it made him obvious. He hated wanting because he had spent too many years turning desire into discipline, affection into performance, hunger into something elegant enough to survive being watched. He hated that Felix could still pull the worst of it out of him with one smile. And Felix, for all his brightness, carried his own private ruin. He liked being wanted too much, not because he was vain, but because wanting had always felt safer than being known. Desire was simple, temporary, easy to survive. Being loved was not. Being loved meant being seen clearly enough to be broken. That was what made this dangerous, not jealousy, not tension, not even want, recognition. The awful, intimate realization that they knew exactly where to hurt each other, and exactly how not to stop. A voice called from the stage entrance. 2 minutes, neither of them moved. Hyunjin's fingers were still at Felix's jaw, warm now, anchoring him in place. "Say it again," Hyunjin said. Felix's breath caught. "What? That I'm jealous." The words landed low and electric. Felix should have laughed, should have turned it into a joke, softened the edge, made it survivable. Instead, he looked directly into Hyunjin's eyes and said very quietly, "You are." Hyunjin exhaled like something in him had finally snapped. Then he smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was beautiful and ruined and full of the kind of certainty that only arrived right before disaster. When he leaned in, it was not enough to kiss. Just enough for Felix to feel the shape of his breath against his mouth. "Then stop smiling at people you don't want," Hyunjin said. The words struck deeper than they should have. Felix stared at him, pulse unsteady, the air between them suddenly too thin to breathe. Because that was the real danger, wasn't it? Not that Hyunjin was jealous, not that Felix liked it. But that beneath all the tension, beneath the sharpness and the games and the years of almosts, Hyunjin had said something neither of them could take back. People you don't want. As if wanting Felix was already a fact. As if the real mistake had never been jealousy, only that it had taken them this long to say it aloud. The call for places came again, sharper this time, cutting through the corridor with the kind of urgency that belonged to live broadcasts and unforgiving schedules. 1 minute. The spell broke first in Felix's hands. His fingers tightened around the water bottle until the plastic bent with a quiet crack, cold droplets slipping over his knuckles and onto the floor. He looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else. For one strange second, all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing and the low, brutal rhythm of the bass pulsing through the walls. Hyunjin stepped back first. It was only half a step, but it felt enormous. The warmth of his hand disappeared from Felix's jaw, leaving behind a phantom imprint that lingered like heat after lightning. Hyunjin's expression had already changed again, composure sliding back into place so smoothly it would have been easy to believe Felix had imagined everything, if not for the darkness still smoldering behind his eyes. He looked immaculate, untouched, calm in the way only dangerous people ever were. Felix hated how quickly that steadiness unsettled him. A staff member rushed past the entrance and glanced inside. 30 seconds. Hyunjin did not look away from Felix. Neither of them spoke for a beat too long. Then Hyunjin adjusted the cuff of his jacket with slow, elegant precision, as if his pulse had not betrayed him moments ago, as if he had not nearly unraveled both of them in the shadow of a backstage corridor. "Fix your expression," he said quietly. Felix blinked. "What?" Hyunjin's gaze flicked over his face, sharp and unreadable. "You look shaken," nearly laughed. The nerve of him. Hyunjin had pressed one sentence against Felix's ribs and left it there like a blade, and now he was standing in front of him looking composed enough to be painted. Felix forced a breath into his lungs. "Whose fault is that?" Something almost amused passed through Hyunjin's face. Almost. Then he turned and walked toward the stage entrance without answering. Felix stared after him for half a second too long, pulse still uneven, before pushing himself off the equipment case and following. The roar of the crowd hit them like impact the moment they stepped into the wings. Light exploded across the stage in violent white and electric blue, hot enough to sting. The air changed instantly, thicker, louder, charged with smoke and sound, and thousands of voices collapsing into one screaming wave. It swallowed everything: thought, breath, distance. This was the part Felix usually loved most, the moment before stepping out. The split second where adrenaline turned his blood bright and everything sharpened into instinct. The lights, the music, the crowd, the familiar violence of performance. It usually burned everything else away. Tonight it only made him more aware of Hyunjin at his side, of the silence between them, of the words still lodged under Felix's skin like splinters. "People you don't want." The intro hit. They moved. The stage took them whole. Everything after that became muscle memory and precision. Music crashed through the arena in hard, glittering waves. Lights strobed. Heat poured down from above in blinding sheets. Felix smiled when he was supposed to smile, hit every mark, every line, every turn with practiced ease. His body knew exactly what to do even while the rest of him remained caught in the corridor 2 minutes ago. He danced. He sang. He laughed into the cameras at all the right moments. And all the while, he could feel Hyunjin like a second pulse somewhere just out of reach. It was unbearable, not because Hyunjin was watching him, because Felix could feel when he wasn't. There were too many people on stage, too many moving parts, too many flashing lights and camera angles and voices tearing through the arena, but awareness of Hyunjin threaded through all of it anyway, sharp and impossible to ignore. The sweep of his hand in peripheral vision. The cut of his silhouette through blue light. The brief press of shoulder against shoulder during formation. The split-second eye contact that landed like impact and vanished just as fast. It should have been easy to disappear into choreography. Instead, every moment felt deliberate, loaded. On the second song, Felix missed a breath. It was nothing visible. Nothing anyone in the crowd would notice. Just a fraction of a second late, a half-beat slip in timing as his gaze caught on Hyunjin across the stage. Hyunjin was already looking at him. Not at the audience, not at the cameras, at him. The look lasted less than a second. It still hit Felix hard enough to send his next breath crooked. Possession lived in strange places, not in touch, not in words. Sometimes only in the unbearable steadiness of being seen too clearly in the middle of everything. Felix recovered before anyone noticed. Years of performance made sure of that. He smiled wider, pushed harder, let the adrenaline carry him through the rest of the set in a bright, relentless blur. But something had shifted. The cameras loved tension. The audience always did. By the third song, they were already feeding on it. Every glance stretched too long drew louder screams. Every near touch sent noise crashing through the venue. Every moment Hyunjin drifted too close sharpened the atmosphere until even Felix could feel the crowd reacting in real time. Hungry for something they could not name and would never fully understand. They thought it was performance. Maybe that was the worst part. Felix caught himself smiling again during a transition, breathless and half-dazed under the lights. Across from him, Hyunjin saw it. And this time, when Felix smiled, Hyunjin smiled back. It was small, private, devastating. The crowd erupted. Felix nearly forgot the next move. After the set, the backstage air felt colder. The adrenaline crash came hard, leaving everything too bright and too sharp at once. Staff swarmed around them with towels, water, touch-ups, schedules. Voices layered over one another in overlapping noise. Someone was laughing too loudly near the dressing room. Someone else was already talking about the next segment. Felix barely heard any of it. His pulse still hadn't settled. He took a bottle of water from a stylist with a distracted thanks and slipped away the first second no one was looking, ducking into the narrow hallway behind the dressing rooms where the noise dimmed into a muffled blur. The silence there felt almost unreal. Cool air kissed the sweat at the back of his neck. His hands were still unsteady. He pressed one palm briefly to the wall and closed his eyes. This was absurd. One conversation. One look. One sentence. And somehow Hyunjin had managed to rearrange the air in Felix's lungs. Footsteps sounded behind him. Felix didn't turn. He knew who it was anyway. The footsteps stopped close enough to feel familiar. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Hyunjin said, "You missed your breath." Opened his eyes slowly. Of course that was what Hyunjin chose to say. He let out a quiet laugh, tired and disbelieving, and turned just enough to look at him. Hyunjin had changed nothing and everything. Sweat still clung to his skin. His stage makeup had softened slightly at the corners. A strand of pale hair had fallen loose across his forehead. Up close he looked less composed now. Less untouchable, more honest. Felix leaned back against the wall. "And you were watching closely enough to notice." Hyunjin's expression did not shift. "I always notice." The words landed cleanly. No irony, no performance. No room left to pretend they meant anything else. Felix went still. There it was again, that dangerous, unbearable clarity. Hyunjin's worst habit was not jealousy. It was honesty, but only in fragments. Only when it could do the most damage. Felix looked at him for a long moment, chest tightening around something too complicated to name. Then he said, softer than he meant to, "That's the problem." Hyunjin's gaze sharpened. Number stepped closer, not enough to trap Felix, only enough to make retreat feel irrelevant. "That," Hyunjin said quietly, "is the only reason this has lasted as long as it has." Forgot how to answer, because he knew exactly what Hyunjin meant. Years of almost. Years of glances held too long and words bent into safer shapes. Years of orbiting each other so closely it had stopped feeling like distance. Even while neither of them dared call it what it was, it had lasted because Hyunjin noticed. Because Felix noticed him noticing. Because neither of them had known how to stop. Felix's throat felt suddenly dry. Outside the hallway, the noise of the venue swelled and blurred. Somewhere, someone called Hyunjin's name. Somewhere else, laughter broke bright and careless against the walls. But here, in the thin quiet between one performance and the next, the world had narrowed again to breath and silence and the unbearable fact of standing too close. Felix looked at Hyunjin and understood, with the slow certainty of disaster, that this was no longer a game either of them could survive by pretending. And for the first time that night, the thought did not frighten him nearly as much as it should have. Felix should have stepped away. The hallway was too narrow, too exposed, too easy for someone to turn the corner and catch them standing there with all that silence between them, thick as confession. The muffled noise beyond the walls was already shifting again. Staff moving, voices rising, shoes scraping over polished floor. The restless machinery of a night that would not pause just because something fragile and dangerous had finally started breaking open between them. But Felix stayed where he was. His shoulder remained against the wall. His pulse remained uneven. And Hyunjin remained too close, close enough that Felix could still feel the heat coming off his skin, still catch traces of sweat and expensive perfume and stage smoke in the cool air between them. Neither of them seemed willing to be the first to move. Hyunjin looked at him with that same unbearable steadiness, like he had already stripped away every easier version of this conversation and found nothing worth saving in them. Felix hated how much that steadiness affected him. He hated that Hyunjin could stand there saying almost nothing and still leave Felix feeling more exposed than if he had touched him again. "What exactly has lasted?" Felix asked, though he already knew. Hyunjin's gaze did not shift. "You know. Say it anyway." The words came out quieter than Felix intended, but sharper too, something between challenge and plea. Hyunjin exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, but Felix caught the flicker in his expression, that brief fracture between patience and restraint, the one that always surfaced when Hyunjin was being forced too close to honesty. It should have made Felix retreat. Instead, it made him want more. Hyunjin tipped his head slightly, studying him in a way that felt too deliberate to be harmless. "You always do this." frowned. Do what? Push until someone says the thing you're too afraid to say first. The words landed with enough precision to feel surgical. Felix went still. There was no accusation in Hyunjin's voice. That would have been easier to survive. No anger, no cruelty, just observation, clean and merciless in the way truth often was. When Hyunjin chose to stop dressing it up, Felix let out a short breath that almost sounded like laughter. And you always act like silence makes you noble. That hit, not visibly. Hyunjin was too practiced for that. But Felix saw the shift anyway. The slight narrowing of his eyes, the quiet hardening of his mouth. Good, let him feel it too. Felix pushed off the wall, not to leave, only to stand straighter, closer. Their space narrowed until the distance between them became something almost absurd, all breath and tension and the unbearable intimacy of not touching. You say just enough to ruin my entire night, Felix said, voice low now, too steady for how fast his pulse was moving. You stand there looking calm and expect me not to ask what you mean. Hyunjin's eyes dropped briefly to Felix's mouth again. It was such a small movement, Felix felt it like impact. When Hyunjin spoke, his voice was quieter than before. You think I'm calm? Felix nearly smiled. You wear it well. Something unreadable passed through Hyunjin's face. Not amusement, not irritation, something older than either, something tired. That isn't the same thing. Answer slipped under Felix's skin too easily. For a second, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, but it no longer felt sharp. It felt dangerous in a different way now, less like a blade, more like the split second before a fall, when the body understands what's happening just before gravity takes over. Felix watched him carefully. Up close, Hyunjin's control had begun to show its seams. There was tension in his shoulders he had not fully disguised. Fatigue at the edges of his eyes. Something too tightly wound in the set of his jaw. Hyunjin always wore composure like armor, but armor was still something you put on because there was something underneath worth protecting. Felix had spent years trying not to wonder what that was. Tonight, he was tired of pretending he didn't already know. You're scared of being obvious, Felix said softly. Hyunjin's expression changed so slightly most people would have missed it. Felix did not. He kept going. You hate not being in control of how you're seen. You hate wanting things that don't fit into whatever version of yourself you can manage in public. Felix's voice dropped lower. And you hate that I make it harder. Silence that followed was absolute, not because Felix was wrong, because he wasn't. Hyunjin stared at him in a way that made the air feel thinner. There it was again. That awful, intimate recognition, sharp enough to wound. The kind that came only from being watched too closely for too long. From learning someone in fragments until eventually you knew where all their weakest walls were. Hyunjin's voice, when it came, was very quiet. And you, he said, make a game out of being wanted because it's easier than admitting you want to be kept. Forgot to breathe. The words hit harder than anything else that night, not because they were cruel, because they were precise. Something in Felix's chest tightened so suddenly it felt almost violent. He looked away first. It was instinct. A small betrayal of composure, but enough. His gaze caught on the dim strip of floor between them, on a dropped piece of silver tape near the wall, on anything that was not Hyunjin's face and the unbearable clarity of being understood too well. Felix laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor in it. That's unfair. Hyunjin answered immediately. It's true. Fingers curled at his sides. He hated this. Hated how easily Hyunjin could peel him open with one sentence spoken too calmly. Hated that part of him wanted to be angry and a worse part wanted to hear more. Wanted to know how much Hyunjin had seen. Wanted to know if being understood this precisely was supposed to feel this much like panic or relief. Felix lifted his gaze again. Hyunjin had not moved, still there, still close, still looking at him like retreat had never been a serious possibility. Felix swallowed. You make it sound simple. Hyunjin's expression softened so faintly Felix almost thought he imagined it. It isn't. That should have eased something. Instead, it made everything worse, because Felix knew that tone, knew the rare quiet sincerity in it. Hyunjin only sounded like that when he was too tired to lie elegantly, and Hyunjin looked tired now, not physically. Not only that, tired in the way people looked when they had been carrying the same unspoken thing for too long. Felix's voice came quieter when he spoke again. Then why now? It was the real question beneath all the others. Why tonight? Why here? Why, after years of saying almost nothing that mattered in words sharp enough to survive? Hyunjin held his gaze for a long moment. Then, with a kind of honesty so unguarded it made Felix's chest ache, he said, "Because I was fine until I saw you smile at someone else and realized I was no longer interested in being reasonable about you." The words settled between them with devastating ease, no performance in them, no elegance, no place to hide. Felix felt his heartbeat stagger. Something hot and reckless moved under his skin, too bright to name and too dangerous to trust. It was not triumph. Not exactly. It was something far worse, something frighteningly close to tenderness, sharpened by the unbearable fact that Hyunjin had just handed him the truth with nothing protecting it. Felix looked at him, really looked, and saw no distance left in Hyunjin at all. Only restraint. Only want. Only the quiet ruin of someone who had finally said enough to make silence impossible. The noise outside the hallway swelled again. Someone calling for reset, someone laughing, a door opening somewhere too close and then shutting again. Neither of them moved. Felix could feel the exact moment something in him gave way, not dramatically, not all at once, just a quiet internal shift like a lock turning. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a breath. "You should have said it sooner." Hyunjin's gaze sharpened with something that looked almost like pain. "You smiled at me like I had time." Stared at him. Then, despite the tension still coiled in his chest, despite the danger and timing and years of badly hidden damage between them, Felix laughed, soft and startled and real. Because of course that was Hyunjin's answer. Because of course it was devastating. Because of course it sounded enough like a confession to make Felix's pulse stumble all over again. And for the first time that night, the smile Hyunjin drew out of him had nothing to do with provocation at all. Hyunjin watched that smile happen in real time. Felix saw the exact moment it caught him off guard. It was small, barely more than a breath of expression. But after years of learning Hyunjin in fragments, Felix knew how to read every subtle shift. The faint pause in his shoulders, the way his gaze sharpened and softened at once, as if he had expected resistance and found something far more dangerous instead. Something warm, something unguarded. For one impossible second, Hyunjin looked almost startled by the softness in Felix's face. Felix felt it too late. The smile had come too easily, too honestly. It lacked all the edges he usually hid behind, none of the practiced amusement, none of the teasing cruelty he used like a shield when things came too close to mattering. This one was worse. This one gave him away. Hyunjin noticed immediately. Of course he did. Something in his expression shifted, something quieter than victory and far more intimate. Not satisfaction, not surprise. Just a subtle, devastating kind of recognition, like he had spent years trying to decide whether Felix ever looked at him differently when he forgot to be careful, and had finally gotten his answer. Felix's pulse stumbled. He should have looked away. He didn't. The hallway suddenly felt too still, too narrow, too quiet. Too full of things neither of them could pretend not to know now. Hyunjin's voice, when it came, had changed again. Lower, softer, stripped of nearly everything except intent. "There," he said quietly. Felix frowned, though his heartbeat was already misbehaving. "There, look." The words landed gently. They still hit hard enough to alter Felix's breathing. Hyunjin held his gaze with a steadiness that made retreat feel childish. "You only smile like that when you forget to defend yourself." His throat tightened. He opened his mouth and found, for once, nothing sharp enough to hide behind. Hyunjin took one slow step closer, not enough to touch. Enough to make Felix feel the shape of his own pulse in places he would rather not notice. "You smile at everyone," Hyunjin said, voice quiet and merciless in the softest way. "But not like that." Could hear the blood in his ears. The fluorescent light overhead hummed faintly. Somewhere beyond the walls, voices rose and fell in indistinct motion. A rolling rack squeaked past at the far end of the corridor. The entire world continued moving around them with casual indifference, and still Felix felt pinned in place by the unbearable intimacy of being seen too clearly. It was one thing to be wanted. It was another to be known. That had always been the more dangerous of the two. Felix swallowed, forcing air into lungs that suddenly felt too tight. "You say things like that," he said, trying for steadiness and only half succeeding, "and then act surprised when I think you're impossible." Something faint and almost fond moved through Hyunjin's expression. Impossible. Felix let out a breath that nearly passed for a laugh. You make honesty sound like a threat. Hyunjin's gaze dropped to Felix's mouth again, slower this time. Deliberate enough that Felix felt heat crawl under his skin. Only because you treat it like one. Heartbeat lurched. That was the problem with Hyunjin when he stopped performing distance. He became impossible to deflect. Every word landed exactly where it would do the most damage, not because he was cruel, but because he paid attention with terrifying precision. Felix had spent years being adored in easy ways. People liked his smile, his warmth, the brightness he wore so naturally it made intimacy look effortless. But Hyunjin had always been the one person who looked long enough to notice the machinery under it. He saw the pauses, the deflections. The way Felix turned sincerity into humor whenever it got too close to bone. He saw all of it. And worse, he waited. Felix looked at him, chest tight with something too tangled to sort cleanly, and understood with sudden, disorienting clarity why Hyunjin frightened him in ways no one else ever had. Not because Hyunjin could hurt him, because Hyunjin could reach him. The realization settled low and heavy. Felix hated how much it felt like relief. He let out a slow breath and leaned back against the wall again, not to retreat, only because standing upright suddenly felt like too much effort for a body trying very hard not to betray him. Hyunjin's gaze tracked the movement, always noticing. Felix dragged a hand through his hair, still damp with sweat, and laughed softly under his breath. You know what the worst part is? Hyunjin's eyes stayed on him. Tell me. His mouth twitched, but the smile this time was tired around the edges. Honest in a way he had not meant to be. The worst part is that I can't even decide if I'm angry at you for saying all this now, he said, voice quieter than before, or angry that you know me well enough to say it at all. Something in Hyunjin's face softened, not visibly enough for anyone else, enough for Felix. Felix was only his name, nothing more, no ornament, no irony, no practiced smoothness, and somehow it was the most intimate thing Hyunjin had said all night. Felix looked up too quickly. A mistake. Hyunjin was already watching him with that same unbearable steadiness. But there was something different in it now, something stripped raw enough to make Felix's chest tighten. You think being known gives someone too much power, Hyunjin said quietly. You've always thought that. Did not answer. He didn't need to. Hyunjin saw the confirmation anyway. His voice softened further until Felix had to focus to hear it over the low hum of the hallway lights. Maybe that's true, Hyunjin said. But being untouched by anyone is its own kind of loneliness. The word struck somewhere Felix had spent years carefully avoiding. He went still. No immediate defense rose to meet it. No laughter, no quick dismissal. No clean way to turn it into something lighter and easier to survive. Because Hyunjin was right and Felix hated how quickly the truth of it moved through him. There was safety in being wanted from a distance. In being admired, desired, loved in fragments. All of it came with exits. With room, with enough distance to remain intact. But untouched was another thing entirely. Untouched meant unwitnessed. Untouched meant no one close enough to bruise you, yes, but no one close enough to hold the parts of you that ached either. Felix looked away again, but this time not because he was trying to escape, only because the sudden pressure in his chest made direct eye contact feel impossible. His voice came quieter when he spoke. You always do this. Hyunjin was still for a beat. Do what? Make me feel understood and cornered at the same time. Silence that followed was softer than the others had been, less sharp, less defensive, no less dangerous. Then Hyunjin said with a quietness that almost undid him, that's because you keep mistaking being seen for being trapped. Closed his eyes, not for long, just long enough to absorb the hit of it. When he opened them again, Hyunjin was still there, still close, still watching, still impossible. And Felix, with his pulse unsteady and his thoughts in ruins, realized something he should have admitted years ago. He had never been afraid of wanting Hyunjin, only of how badly he wanted to be wanted back.